E nā iwi, e nā mana, e nā hoa mahi, tēnā koutou katoa. E mihi ana kia koutou, kua tae mai ki te tautoko tēnei kaupapa. Nā mihi nui ki Vangelis Vitalis, te kai kōrero o te rā, tēnā koe. I'm Stuart Little, Chief Strategist at the Treasury, and it's my real pleasure to introduce this Treasury guest lecture series for the day. I'm famous for my very rapid health and safety briefing, so listen carefully and quickly. Three things I will tell you. The first, if there's a fire, follow the Treasury staff and use the stairwells. There's one over there and one down there. Do not use the lift, obviously. And if there is a fire alarm, take it seriously because we had a drill yesterday. The second, if there's an earthquake, drop, cover and hold. This building, I know from experience, is extremely robust to earthquakes. And third, if you need a bathroom, head back out round that way beside the kitchenette, and there's some doors there saying bathrooms, and you do not need a security card to get back in, so you won't have to walk down to the ground floor. So thank you. Our theme for this year and this series has been navigating global shifts, resilience, challenges and opportunities. And when we set this theme last year, we couldn't have expected to see what was going to happen this year in practice. We could see the geopolitical shifts and we knew this was going to be important. But what happened this year is beyond belief. And there's a certain irony for me. At the same time as we've got one of the world's biggest bringing together of every country, from this morning from Paraguay and Germany to Brazil and Japan, at the same time, the centripetal forces in terms of conflict and division have never been stronger. And so it's a very hard area to navigate. But I'm really pleased that we've had such a diversity of lectures over the year, from geopolitics to international relations to some hard-edged economic things in terms of the implications of the Hormuz situation. But we haven't talked much about trade and trading relationships. And so I think that's what we'll bring today. Because the relatively stable rules-based conditions that have underpinned New Zealand's trade success for much of the last few decades can't be taken for granted anymore. And I do think that requires a shift in how we manage both the opportunities and the risks in those markets. And it creates a broad challenge for New Zealand in how we maintain the openness and connections that drive our prosperity while strengthening our ability to navigate shocks, adapt to change, and operate confidently in a much more uncertain global landscape. So I'm really, really pleased to introduce our guest speaker today, Vangelis Vitalis, who's the Deputy Secretary for Trade and Economic at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He has a huge CV, so I won't go through all of it, but he leads New Zealand's trade and economic diplomacy and oversees virtually everything. And just some examples, he's been our chief negotiator on the recent New Zealand-India Free Trade Agreement. But if it's anything to do with trade and New Zealand in the last 20, 30 years, he has had a deep hand in this. And that includes agreements with the European Union, the CPTPP, ASEAN, China, Malaysia, and the rest. He's also served as ambassador and permanent rep to the World Trade Organization in Geneva, ambassador to the European Union and NATO, and earlier roles, amongst other things, in the OECD and work in postings in Canberra and Moscow. Yes, I know I shouldn't talk you up too much, Vangelis, but the reason I was so keen to get him to come and talk to you today, and at this stage in the lecture series, is he has a profound understanding of international relations and a deep understanding of economics. But what he brings to that brings those together in a practical public policy framework. And I think as we go through this, what does it all mean? Where do we go from here? And with that, I just want to reinforce our Chatham House Rules Convention, because, as you know, the Chatham House is you can talk about what you've learnt, but you can't attribute to who said it. And Vangelis is a career civil servant. We are all, those of us who we are studiously political, neutral, and we want to make sure that nothing is misinterpreted that we want to say. And I want to encourage him to be as free and frank as he can be. So not only would I say stick to the rules of Chatham House, but please stick to the spirit as well, both those of you here and those of you online. Let me finish by just saying I'll invite Vangelis to the floor. He will talk for about 30 minutes or so, and then I will open up to questions. Those of you who are online, feel free to post your questions in the Q&A function in Teams, and I will moderate the questions and answers with that. So with that, thank you so much, and thanks for being with us today, Vangelis.
Thank you very much. I was really pleased to get this invitation some time ago, because it's an opportunity to really think about what it is we're trying to do in trade strategy. And so what I really want to talk about, I'm going to sort of refresh your memories why trade matters, and I'm not going to devote a lot of time to that. I'm going to then talk about the international context that we face out there as a small, distant economy that has a relative measure of trade dependency. I'm going to talk about our trade strategy. I'm going to talk about it in 3 parts, but I'm going to add a 4th element that I think is really important that I don't think we think about enough on the trade side of the shop, and this is a sort of a self-criticism, which is the domestic policy enablers for trade policy, and maybe the kinds of things that we should be thinking about, but perhaps are not geared up properly, kind of in a structural sense, to really think about. So let me start with the why trade matters. The standard thing we say is 1 in 4 New Zealand jobs depends on trade. If you're an exporting firm, your productivity is up to 32% higher than a domestically focused firm, and incomes in exporting firms tend to be higher, between 10 and 15%. So jobs, incomes, productivity, trade is clearly one of those important drivers. I would like to read you, though, something that I read in 2017 when I first took this job. It was repeated again most recently in 2022 and then again in 2024 by the OECD. And essentially it says it is well accepted that distance from large global markets works against international connection, negatively impacts an economy and its productivity performance. Then it goes on, weak international connection accounts for over half of New Zealand's productivity gap relative to the OECD average. And that theme keeps coming up. And that's in the OECD's various working papers. So that's sort of why trade matters, but it also sets out kind of the challenge that we face. And I must say, during COVID, our connectivity shrunk and withered. And I never forgot how quickly our situation changed as a consequence of what was happening internationally. So that connectivity piece that we're trying now to restructure and rebuild is one of the really big challenges I think we continue to face. There's lots of things to talk about the tyranny of distance and so on. There's lots of arguments about it, both good and the negative and so on. But fundamentally, that weak connectivity is going to continue to be a challenge. And I do see trade agreements as one way to drive those connections, but also to give us that dynamic productivity gain back, because it's not just, it's productivity writ large, it's that enabler for the corridor of innovation, of knowledge transfer, competition, and so on that helps drive growth back home. That now brings me to the kind of the international context, and I really want to, I don't want to dwell too long on this because people have heard me speak, or some of you at least will have heard me speak about the end of the golden weather. So my main observation is that over the last 6 or 7 years, it really has been the end of what was a fantastic period for New Zealand trade policy. And I would argue particularly for New Zealand agricultural trade, but more generally as well. And that golden weather, I've always argued, had 3 distinct features. And the first was rules that worked. In 1995, the World Trade Organization came into force, a set of agreements, and those agreements were sort of enforceable mechanisms that the big countries followed the rules. And when you took a big country to court in Geneva, you were able, if you won, that big country was willing to observe the rules and bring its regime into compliance. That was a really important feature of the golden weather. We took cases against the United States, against the European Union, against Indonesia, against Australia, Canada twice. We won all those cases, and in each case, the big country brought their regime into compliance, and trade continued to flow. Not a perfect system by any means, but nevertheless gave a measure of certainty and transparency. The second feature of this golden weather period was that you could reasonably say in 2010 and again, and even in 2016, you could reasonably look at the overall trend line and say that for a New Zealand economy, global protectionism was in decline. Subsidies were coming down, tariffs were reducing, and even the prevalence of non-tariff measures and non-tariff barriers was, in essence, really starting to turn in the right direction. In other words, removing that friction for New Zealand trade. Unfortunately, you can't say that anymore. So there's a lot of statistics out there, but the one that I like most is the one about export restrictions being imposed, which of course has become very fashionable once again. Pre-COVID in 2019, for the previous 10 years, the average was about 20 new export restrictions a year. The average now is 224. So there's been quite a shift. That's just specific export restrictions. That's not non-tariff barriers or non-tariff measures. The explosion there has been even greater. So the first two features, rules and protectionism declining, were clear, and also the social license, both internationally and I would argue domestically, was in general that New Zealanders thought trade and trade agreements were, in general, a good thing. And that was expressed in the New Zealand Parliament by the two major political parties consistently supporting all of the trade agreements that got negotiated, whether it was China. It's hard to remember sometimes how controversial China was at the time, the FTA with China, the FTA with ASEAN, the FTA with Korea, right through that period of the golden weather until about 2014-15. And that bipartisanship, that strong social license, was a real feature of what we were able to do during that period. So rules, openness, and social license were the real features of that golden weather. Unfortunately, and to use a cliche, the jungle is definitely growing back for New Zealand trade. The rules are clearly no longer functional. So I should correct myself here. The rules are still there. The rules still exist, but the big players are increasingly ignoring or breaking those rules. And this is not simply a President Trump phenomenon. We are now seeing it from other countries as well. My point about protectionism I've already made, which is the fact that we had this openness, this inexorable decline, which has now been reversed. I think the troubling element is not just that people are using tariffs more, but they're also turning to other tools in the toolbox, subsidies. There are industrial subsidies, agricultural subsidies are at an all-time high. And of course, we're seeing industrial policy come into play. There's a good economic basis to argue for industrial policy, but increasingly, I would argue, we're seeing some of the big players use industrial policy as a form of protectionism. And again, if you think about us as an exporting nation, that runs us into a new and emerging challenge we're going to need to grapple with. One of the fundamental features of the golden weather and through all of my career is that we did have the major powers, particularly the United States, leading in this space, delivering and improving and building up the rules-based system. That's clearly not the case. And I think the important thing we've got to accept, it's not just a President Trump phenomenon. So you have America First, that speaks for itself. You also have a Make in India policy in India, which is profoundly looking at a protectionist model to develop its industry. Although I do think it's interesting that they're starting to open up and starting to negotiate sort of relatively limited trade agreements. Then you see the European Union, where they talk about strategic autonomy, and I think there are some serious challenges emerging there. If you think about the position they're taking recently on steel, and the challenges I think that they're all grappling with. Then there's the case of China with its dual circulation theory, and I think we do need to understand what that is designed to do. It is designed to build its own resilience, its own food security, and that does involve, I'm afraid, increasing protectionism and subsidies, and China is a major subsidizer. A recent OECD report released less than a month ago shows the colossal subsidization of their sectors across a range of areas. Most of those areas, by the way, are outside the rules. It's not that they're breaking the rules. We simply don't have rules to capture that kind of activity. So in that context, where all four of the major global trading powers, both emerging or re-emerging and existing ones, what does that then mean in terms of the way we need to think about what that world looks like? I think the first thing we've got to accept is that it's a new world disorder that we're going to have to grapple with. So the way we've thought about the world, the way we've thought about the World Trade Organization and the rules that it's set for us, we simply cannot rely on that alone being the way in which we think about how we're going to position ourselves. What we don't know, is this going to be a Metternician concert of Asia, concert of Europe, concert of the Americas, series of regional structures that we're going to have to navigate? Or is it going to be an even more brutal version of that regionalization, that fundamental fragmentation that we're going to face? I think it all says to me that that sort of idea of a Panglossian nirvana out there is really well and truly over. So the challenge we face now is, what does our strategy need to look like in this kind of world where we are now shifting? And I think an important thing to say there, and others have said this as well, is clearly a nostalgic look back to that golden weather period. That is not a strategy. So we are going to need to think about what that needs to look like. And for us, it really needs to look, I would argue, in these three externally focused pieces, but also a crucial fourth element, which I do think is domestic policy and understanding the way in which those tools we can use can help drive trade. And I think it's really important not to lose sight of the fact that it's not just exports, but imports matter too. So these two things are really important for our economy, both in terms of driving innovation, so the transfer of knowledge, competition, and so on. We should not lose sight of that, even though often it's very sexy to talk about the exports, but the imports also play a critically important role for us. What this all means is we have risks now. I talked about the disintegration. We see lots of great power rivalry, lots of discussion about my favorite concept, the Thucydides trap. And my staff know all about the Melian dialogue as well. You're welcome to Google that. So the risk of coercion, the risk of pressure to take sides, to make decisions on key investments and infrastructure and so on, those are going to become increasing features of the way in which we're going to need to think about not just trade policy, but public policy more generally. And all of that in the context of rising protectionism means more uncertainty, less transparency, and a much more challenging environment to be operating in. So then, as I reflect on what our strategy needs to look like, you need to also think, so what is the purpose of our trade strategy here? Obviously, a key part of it is the contribution it can make to the economy and how we best create those transmission belts to drive back into the feedback loops you need to help grow the economy here. So I talked about productivity, talked about incomes and employment, the dynamic productivity gains from trade. So the old way of modeling shocks to the system of removing tariffs isn't much good for us because we don't have many tariffs anymore. So we are going to think of some of those much more important and significant areas, which I believe dwarf the benefits of tariff liberalization, which really is this knowledge, innovation, competition piece, the dynamic productivity gains that we've got. But part of our trade policy also needs to be mitigating uncertainty for New Zealand exporters. So trying to build some rules where we can, trying to improve the way in which we implement and utilize our existing agreements. We've got to also diversify or create optionality at the very least. We can't force exporters to change and switch markets, but we can certainly create them these new opportunities out there. And we must not lose sight of the importance of social license. So losing the social license at home means not being able to negotiate these agreements internationally. And that, of course, then has very profound implications if you think about where we might be in 5 to 10 years there. And I use the phrase here to avoid the Einstellung effect. So the Einstellung effect is this concept, German concept, which is to say that in these kinds of difficult circumstances, you need to try different things and new things. You can't simply keep doing what we did over the last 5 to 10 years. You've actually got to try some new things, and the Einstellung effect is permission to take some risks. So for us, there are these 4 areas, the 3 outward-facing ones, rules, resilience, and innovation. I want to describe for you in each case what that does mean. And then I want to turn to the domestic policy piece, depending on how I'm going for time. But let me start with the rules. And there, The rules are very much about what we do at the World Trade Organization to try to sustain a set of rules. If you think about sanitary and phytosanitary measures, technical barriers to trade, customs valuation procedures, all of these boring mechanisms of trade, I think it's really interesting. No one has pulled out of those systems. So those systems continue to function. People want to make sure that the food that they eat is safe, that the standards that apply are as common or as legitimate as possible. So I think there is a lot to be said still for believing in that existing part of the system, but then thinking, how do we build that out? How do we sustain the elements that we really need to push out on? So on the rules piece, it's the World Trade Organization. It's clearly going to be more trade agreements. And trade agreements, we must not pretend, are somehow transformative in and of themselves. And this is my point about the importance of domestic policy. So trade agreements are great, and we do know that they have a certain resonance politically on whichever side you're on the debate. But I do think it is really important that we don't overstate the benefits. So you'll see in the national impact assessments that we've done on the EU and the India FTA and the UK FTA, very conservative estimates about the gains. And I think that's a really important thing to bear in mind, because the real drivers of these agreements will actually be our domestic settings. These free trade agreements, as an economist, sometimes you struggle with these trade agreements because you wonder about diversification, you wonder about where the real gains are. Are you just switching, or are you creating more production? What does that mean for your sustainability? So there are big questions there. But in the end, you run up against some pretty brutal realities. So the India Free Trade Agreement we did essentially for 4 reasons. One, basically to catch up to others who had negotiated or were negotiating trade agreements with India. The second was to get some advantages for New Zealand exporters. The third was really to create some optionality. And the fourth was to get access to kind of integrate ourselves, not to the 1.4 billion people, but to the 700 million middle class that will be in India by 2030. Now, by catching up, I always use these. I've got sort of 3 examples here in my slide deck, which is all the slides that I'm going to use, just to make the observation that so India has colossally high tariffs, from 33% to 150% on wine, 66% on honey, 33% on sheep meat. Before the free trade agreement that Australia struck nearly 4 years ago now, we had 85% of Indian imports of sheep meat. Within 2 years of the free trade agreement, we'd collapsed to 9%, and the Australians really dominate that market. It's not a huge market yet, but it's a growing market. What it tells you is that you cannot compete in the market if you're paying the 33% and you're having to share it with your importer, or the importer's passing it on to the consumer. It's clear that you can't sustain your position in the market. Fish and seafood. The World Bank estimates India will be the largest seafood market in the world by 2031. Within 2 years again, we actually declined by 67%, and the Australians shot up, admittedly off a low base, but nevertheless the figures are striking, 269%. And again, the story is that 33% tariff that we simply cannot trade over competitively if someone else is already at 0. Forestry is the other example. Again, even here, the tariff is relatively modest. It's, by Indian standards, it's 10 and 14%, depending on the product. They increased by 119%, and we fell by nearly 20%. So again, you can see the point I'm trying to make is that in these conditions, governments come under enormous pressure from exporters to those markets to say, what are you doing to level the playing field here? Now, in the India FTA, and I'm not going to, this isn't a presentation about the India FTA, we did also negotiate advantages for New Zealand in apples and horticulture, in honey, in kiwi fruit, and so on, and in some of the rules and disciplines. So the idea of the agreement is also to keep us abreast of our key competitors in that market. But let me come back to the rules and the resilience. So the rules are really about free trade agreements. And the thing I want you to reflect on, perhaps something we can return to in the Q&A, is we've roughly covered about 70 to 74% of New Zealand exports are now covered by these international treaties, free trade agreements. We can argue about exactly how that works. But my main point is, to get us up higher, we would need an agreement with the United States. And then there's a whole series of relatively modest and small deals. And then there's the countries with which we hardly export at all, but are clearly going to be the future. So if you think about the continent of Africa, that will be our kind of offensive thought. And then we have a series of defensive plays that we're going to need to think about in that rules space because of the deals that the United States has struck around our region. To give you one very practical example, the United States has a deal now with Bangladesh, which removes the 35% tariff on dairy products. Once that agreement comes into force, the United States dairy exporter will face a zero tariff into Bangladesh. We'll still be paying the 35%. That's a market worth about $600 million to nearly $1 billion, depending on the year. It's an overwhelmingly dairy play, but you can see that we're going to have this challenge, and the pressure is going to be on the government to respond to this challenge of a defensive play, and then what's our offensive play into the areas where we really have no meaningful presence and certainly no trade architecture. But I invite you also to think about what that means for social license in New Zealand in the context of what we've been seeing here domestically over the last few months. So how do we persuade New Zealanders and sustain bipartisanship? I think that's one of our real challenges. I want to talk about the resilience piece relatively briefly because I think there's some interesting things that we've done there. A key part of the resilience play, of course, is better implementation of the agreements we have. So to give you a very vivid demonstration of that, utilisation rates of the UK Free Trade Agreement are over 90%, so very impressive figure. I mean, genuinely impressive. The EU FTA, which of course has added $3 billion worth of new exports into Europe, it's only about less than 60% utilisation rate. So we have New Zealand companies that are not using the agreement, they're exporting to it, but they are leaving money on the table. There's clearly work to be done in that area. We don't really know where we are with the other agreements because we don't have the data sharing relationships that we set up through the UK and the EU free trade agreements, and we now have with the UAE. And we're hopeful that we're going to have the same with India to tell us how and where we need to focus our attention. So that's fairly orthodox so far. The unorthodox thing that we've done is this new trade agreement that we struck with Singapore, the Agreement on Trade and Essential Supplies. That agreement was not a consequence of the fuel crisis. It came at just the right moment, though. It was actually a product of Singapore's and New Zealand's experience during COVID. So the very vivid lessons we learnt then prompted the Ministry of Trade and Industry in Singapore and us in a cross-agency effort, and do want to acknowledge the fact that was a genuinely cross-agency effort, MB Customs, MPI, us, all working together, NZTE as well, to build this very different type of agreement. This is not about expanding trade, this is about securing supply lines. And the critical thing that we did was not only identify which products we would need from each other in the time of a crisis, but a commitment to waive our right through the World Trade Organization agreements to impose export restrictions on one another. So that's a very significant step that both of us took to say, in the time of a crisis, even if we're under pressure to make sure things are happening at home, we will not impose an export restriction on the products you, Singapore, identify, obviously food, and that you, New Zealand, identify, which in our case happen to be fuel, a whole range of plastics, and a range of other products that are readily visible on our website. So a very unorthodox response, kind of unorthodox trade agreement, but I think very much a product of the time. Our big challenge now is, what do we do with this agreement? How do we build it out? Who do we build it out with? And what do we need this to look like to respond to not the last crisis, but the future crises to come? And that's clearly a work in progress. Part of our resilience, of course, is expanding the existing trade agreement. So very important here, we have the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, a colossal agreement, 10 ASEAN countries, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. Who might want to join? We've got a lengthening list: Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Hong Kong, China, among others. And then we have the CPTPP, which now is almost in double digits in terms of the lengthening queue of countries that want to join that agreement as well. I do see these as critical parts of our resilience as an economy, and I'm very focused on making CPTPP look like a global agreement rather than simply a regional one. So it originally was essentially the Trans-Pacific countries. It was the TPP originally. What we've tried to do is so we brought in successfully the United Kingdom from Europe. In the queue, we have the United Arab Emirates. So we're hoping to bring the United Arab Emirates into it, which would really fundamentally change the way we think about the agreement. And I would argue these are the kinds of agreements where we're going to build new rules, where the new order is going to emerge. It's going to emerge from these plurilateral agreements. And a crucial piece here is the CPTPP EU dialogue that we've been working on, and a number of us have been working on for some time now, because bringing those two blocks together, that becomes a very significant piece. And if you think just in the digital sphere alone, the two blocks together, we shouldn't really talk about CPTPP as a block, but nevertheless, the individual members of CPTPP plus the European Union together account for more than 60% of digital trade flows. So very significant if we could get a digital trade agreement among us. So that's that sort of that resilience piece about keeping us there. The innovation piece is really where we're willing to try some new things. And as a small state, I would argue we must take a few risks. And here, I mentioned the CPTPP EU dialogue. A very significant event is going to happen in about 3 weeks in Auckland. Minister Macleay will be hosting a grouping called the Future of Investment Trade Partnership Agreement. This was the brainchild of 4 countries that came together: Singapore, New Zealand, Switzerland, and the UAE. We met over a year before Prime Minister Carney talked about the rupture and the middle countries needing to work together. The 4 of us got together a year before that. We thought we need to find a way to work together as small and medium-sized states. So from that 4, there'll be nearly 20. There'll be 16 members and 4 new participants coming at Minister of Trade level to Auckland, and we have a set of work streams coming out of that. A really important one will be the supply chains piece. Goes back to my unorthodox kind of trade agreements piece. What kind of elements can we build into this grouping in the supply chain space? A mixture of sort of legally binding commitments and also declaratory sort of aspirational language. How do we build that piece together? A second stream will be, how do we coordinate better the 16 of us with other groupings? And how do we push back against non-tariff barriers that are out there? Because often we as small and medium-sized states, and this grouping, I should explain, has countries like Rwanda in it, Norway, Switzerland, it has Korea, it has Malaysia, Brunei. So it's a wide grouping, a pretty generous definition of small and medium-sized given Korea's scale and size. But the ambition is there from all of us to really find a way to sustain the rules, work together in the WTO, work together in regional and global trade agreements, but above all, make sure our voices are heard in that process so that we've got some agency still, and the critical mass that we hope this Future Investment Trade Partnership gives us is one of those innovations that we've put out there. Another innovations is the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. This is the idea that originally three small countries, Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore, got together, set the rules up for ourselves. So what kind of digital rules would work for small states with SMEs at their heart? We didn't want to be in a situation where the big countries would impose rules on us or the big tech companies would be driving these rules. So we looked to set up the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. That now includes Korea, Costa Rica, and Peru are just about to join, and we have a queue that, of nearly nine other economies lined up to try and join the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. And again, that's our innovation, our attempt to try something new, have an open plurilateral. If you can meet the standard, then you are welcome to be a party to the agreement. But the standard is a really important element in that. I'm very conscious of my time, and I do want to talk about the final leg. So the 3 legs that I've talked about, the rules, the innovation, the resilience, these 3 pieces, they're very much the outward-facing piece, the piece that the international policy sections of other agencies and MFAT kind of work together on to drive internationally. But I do think one of the things that we are really not doing perhaps as well as we should be, and I include us in that, is the domestic policy piece, because that is the real enabler, both of the import and export piece. And for me, there are 6 elements to this. The first is infrastructure. And I don't have solutions here. I've got a series of questions. And my first question on the infrastructure thing, do we think enough about that infrastructure, the roads, the railway, the ports, the airports? Do we think of them enough as enablers of trade, both inwards and outwards, rather than simply these functions of the domestic economy? Because they are critical enablers. And to give you one that I'm really worried about, it's the green shipping revolution that's happening out there. These are these colossal ships that are simply, that would not be able to come to New Zealand, despite the fact that their carbon footprint is much, much lower, but our ports are simply not built to take those kinds of vessels. Within 5 years, we risk being really shut out of that market. And one of the things that we're trying to do to try to make sure we're part of that game on our side of the shop is something called the Green Economy Partnership Agreement, which we're negotiating with Singapore, Chile, and us. And we hope to expand that in the way that we do the other agreements. And one of the key themes that we're looking at is, what do these green shipping corridors need to look like? How do your regulatory settings work? How does that enable trade? But it is that infrastructure discussion that I think we need to have through a trade lens, as well as that more general piece that we do domestically. The second is skills. And there's skills in general. There's the education piece. There's the usual things I could say about the STEM subjects. But I actually also mean, are our exporters being supported to have the skills that they need to operate internationally? There's management capabilities where we are genuinely very weak indeed. So we have these brilliant entrepreneurs, but we don't have the people that can do the nuts and bolts of managing exports and working that through, particularly operating in a small and medium enterprise space. And that is, I think, one of our really big challenges. If you think about the composition of our economy and the fact that you've got many SMEs that do a small amount of trade internationally, how do we, and again, I don't have the answer, but I'm asking the question, how do you build those skills for those SMEs to really expand or grow and then have that greater contribution back into our economy? Services and digital. So the irony is, of course, that the things that are most explainable to the public are, of course, what are you doing on seafood? What are you doing on wood? What are you doing on sheep meat? What's happened to the tariff on this? But actually, we are missing a big, big part of our economy, which is, of course, the services sector. How do we bring that better into the trade agreements? And how do we make sure that services exporters who don't even know that they're services exporters can see these agreements as giving them that additional certainty and transparency? And then there's the digital space. So we are starting to create those rules, but are we well enough informed about what the digital exporters need? It's not often an enjoyable process talking to those digital entrepreneurs, because they get very impatient with bureaucrats who are there just to impose more red tape on them because they've always got solutions. But nevertheless, there are lots of practical things you can do in the digital trade agreement space. You can make sure that the data that a company has doesn't have to be localized in the economy that they're exporting to. One of the big features of the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, and indeed of CPTPP, meant that a New Zealand firm did not have to store its data in Vietnam or in Malaysia or in any of the other economies. It could choose to do it in the cloud, at home, or indeed, if it chose to, in Vietnam. Before the agreement, had to be in Vietnam, with all the costs and risks that are associated with that. The fourth area really is a question of, what do we do about industrial policy? And for me, a big piece of that is the research and development piece. I've got, it's very easy for me to say, in the trade space, we've got high tolerance for risk, to taking a few chances and trying new agreements, working with small countries and so on. If you think about the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, the Green Economy Partnership Agreement, we've got a set of pieces of architecture where we've tried some things. I think we need to do something similar in the R&D space. Have we thought enough about what's the future of food 20, 30, 50 years out? Where do we think the agri-environmental space is going to be? Where's the big software development going to come that revolutionizes the agriculture sector? Again, I don't have the answers to any of those, but it feels to me like the kind of thing we do need to spend some money on and accept that there will not always be the kind of return we might hope in the near future. The fifth one, of course, very fashionable at the moment, is AI. Now, I can immediately see in the work that we do huge benefits from AI, including for exporters, including in particular for services exporters, to use an AI tool to delve into the trade agreements that we've negotiated, to find out, so, okay, I'm an architect, and I want to deliver a service to Vietnam or to Peru, which trade agreement is best suited to me? Where have I got some advantages over my competitors? Now, that will take my staff a considerable amount of time and effort to do, which they could spend much more productively elsewhere. But AI tools can really help drive that. And I'd like to think, too, the AI tools can help us improve the way in which we talk to New Zealand exporters, particularly services exporters, where it's not easily understood what it is we do, how our schedules work, what a positive list is, what a negative list is, mode 1, 2, 3, 4, et cetera, et cetera. There's even this talk about mode 5. So all really interesting, but can we think about how AI might help us there? That's just one example. There are lots of other things that AI has the potential to do, really help us in that export drive space. And finally, and I really will stop now, Struan, and I'm really pleased that in the long-term insights briefing that we did with MB and MFAT together, we talked about the significance of what's happening in our neighbourhood. So the emergence of the ASEAN Regional Economic Community, I would not bet against that over the next 20 to 30 years, that doesn't become more integrated, more coherent, and more powerful piece. I think there's a very profound question for us and Australia about what we're going to do with the single economic market. So we've got this wonderful piece of architecture ourselves, which we can, of course, tinker with and improve. There's some big things you could do there, like movement of people, but you could tinker and improve, you could make some marginal improvements. But is our vision for that relationship really determined bilateralism? Or is it actually thinking about where that single economic market needs to be in terms of alignment, even integration with the ASEAN Regional Economic Community? What does that need to look like? How would you start that process? And I would argue there's a very straightforward way to start thinking about that, which is through the Singapore relationship that both we and Australia have, that strategic economic partnership. We both have the numerous pieces of architecture that both of us have. And again, thinking about the model that we used in the SEM, particularly the very groundbreaking Trans-Tasman Mutual Recognition Agreement, arrangement, I should say. You think about qualifications and standards. Is this the place to try to work that out? Is this the way in which we can help shape what happens in that regional economic community out there on our doorstep? I think it also raises profound questions about what we do with the Pacific, but probably haven't got time to touch on that as well. So look, let me conclude. I hope I've given you a bit of a flavour, first of all, of the challenge we face out there, that the world really has fundamentally changed, that the jungle is definitely growing back. But I hope I've also given you a sense that there is a plan to manage this. And as a small state, we absolutely have agency to shape and inform what's happening out there and to kind of manage that. And we're not alone. There are a lot of other countries like us, small, medium-sized state. The overwhelming bulk of the WTO membership share our anxieties. And by working together, we can find ways, perhaps less orthodox, perhaps far from perfect, and certainly we're having to rethink the concept of comparative advantage here. But as these overlapping pieces come together, I do think that the rules, resilience, and innovation piece gives us that framework through which we can move internationally. But what I really think, and I just wonder whether structurally we're geared up for that, is that domestic piece, is how does the trade piece, as I said, these trade agreements are not in and of themselves transformative. Transformative is when that piece, the external piece, is harnessed by the domestic policy levers that we've got. And that relationship is the one we really need to be thinking hard about. Thank you.